Hey guys, welcome to Bad Girls Good Advice. This is a podcast made for teens by teens. Just to reintroduce ourselves, I'm Safa.
I'm Ariba.
I'm Abrar.
I'm Dima.
And just to give you a little bit of description on why we started the podcast, there are a lot of teen-specific issues, but the only resources to combat these issues are made by adults who may not have the same experiences as us. So we made this podcast to give advice and just to make adolescent life easier, to start conversations, and to use our podcast to spread awareness. And we are, of course, friends, and so we're just using our experiences to grow together as a group. If you're new here, you can find us on Instagram at badgirls_goodadvice, on Twitter at badgirls_advice, and also feel free to email us. Our email is badgirlsgoodadvice@gmail.com. All right, the topic we're going to discuss today is drugs, and we actually want to give a trigger warning before we want to start to anyone who might be affected by the topics we discuss in this episode. We'll be talking about things like peer pressure, relationships, and drugs. And before we start, we also wanted to explain causes of addiction and also clarify that our goal isn't to demonize anyone who may be struggling. And the only way we can prevent and mitigate crises is to understand and empathize with users. So we're now going to start off with the causes of addiction.
So addiction is actually a mental illness. We should never, like Safa said before, stigmatize anybody who is addicted to anything. You don't have to be just addicted to drugs. You can be addicted to video games or phone. Addiction is in the form of anything and everywhere. So why someone may turn to drugs can be, depression, family, it's a coping mechanism, the environment they grew up, spirituality. For example, indigenous communities use tobacco during their smudging ceremony because they believe that it cleanses the body of negative spirits. Like I said before, addiction is a mental illness. So it's biological and it can be genetically inherited. For example, if alcoholism runs in your family, you're more likely to be addicted to alcohol than maybe someone else whose family does not have alcoholism in it.
So for today, we're going to be focusing, our first point is going to be about peer pressure. And peer pressure is social influence to adopt a particular type of behavior, dress, or attitude in order to be accepted as a part of a group of your equals, so your peers. And there's three main types of influence, which is spoken, unspoken. So we'll be focusing on four. So there's spoken, unspoken, direct, and indirect. Spoken is where you're directly asking someone or persuading someone to do something. Unspoken is much more indirect. It's much more, basically you'll witness something where, for example, you'll see your friend skipping school and there's sort of this underlying pressure to go along with them. They're not asking you, hey, let's go skip this class. It's, I'm gonna skip, and that's it. It's like you fill in the blanks, like, do you want to come with me? And then direct is where someone puts you in the situation where you're forced to make that decision. So for example, you're handing someone a drink at a party where you're forced to decide what to do on the spot. And then indirect is, for example, you hear that at a party you're going to, there's going to be drinks served, and you become curious as to what you'll be experimenting with that night. But we also want to clarify that peer pressure doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to be bad. And there can be a positive influence to study, for example, to go to school, to go to practice, to get a job, to spend time with your family. It 100% does not have to be a negative type of influence.
It's really important to make sure that you surround yourself with these types of people who will give you this positive peer pressure that Dima's talked about. It's really important to think about what kinds of people we surround ourselves with, and we have to be critical about the types of people that we choose to be friends with. If we find that the people that we generally hang around might not be the best influence on us, they might be offering us, whether it be drugs or alcohol or just anything that we feel isn't good or safe or is a negative form of peer pressure, we need to be aware of that, and we need to try to stay away from those people as much as we can. And we need to try to avoid it by staying away from these people who we might think might have a negative influence on us. And as Dima said, surround ourselves with people and friends who would rather benefit us and be a positive influence on our lives.
And it's also important to understand that different people have different forms of influence. So for example, when your best friend is offering you something, you may be more willing to take it because you're not understanding. As a friend, you have some sort of bias towards them, right? It's my friend. They're not going to harm me. Their intentions aren't going to be anything evil or malicious. But then, for example, for a classmate that you don't really talk to, that sphere of influence is much smaller because you don't really talk to them. You don't have any sort of established relationship. So you always have to be aware of somebody's intentions, no matter how much you trust them.
And it's important to make sure that if we do find ourselves in an environment where there are things that are happening that we know we shouldn't be a part of, we need to be able to say no to, if whether someone's offering us something, or if we're in that sort of environment, we need to be able to take ourselves out of that environment and distance ourselves from those people.
Yeah, and it's also really important that if you have problems with peer pressure, you should feel comfortable like talking to someone you trust, a parent, a teacher, a school counselor. And there are also helplines that can help you with this. Wellness Together Canada and Kids Help Phone are some nationwide services. There's also Connects Ontario, Distress and Crisis Ontario, and Good to Talk, which are of course specific to Ontario. And there's also for First Nations, Métis and Inuit, National Native Alcohol and Drug Abuse Program and National Youth Solvent Abuse Program. And thankfully, Canada.ca also has a lot of resources to deal with both addiction and loss of friends and family to addiction. So there's a lot of resources online that can also help you with that.
And these resources, there's a lot of anonymous options. So if you feel that you might, get someone into trouble, or you might get yourself into trouble, there's a lot of anonymous resources, because at the end of the day, the rehabilitation is much more important than punishing someone or criminalizing what they're doing.
Yeah. And that's actually a really good link into our first segment, which is actually our advice segment. And so we have some questions. Sorry if we didn't get to your questions that were sent to our Instagram, but here are the questions that we received.
So our first question comes from a 14-year-old boy who said, I see all my friends constantly posting on their stories about different juice flavors, and I'm wondering what I should do. So just to clarify, juice is the vape liquid. So he says, should I talk to them? I don't want to get them in trouble, but I don't know what to do.
Okay, well, it can be really scary, seeing someone you grew up with, seeing a friend of yours turn to drugs and do something that can cause a lot of harm to their body. And what's really important to note is you might just think it's vape right now. You might just think it's e-cigarettes. And, cigarettes have kind of branded themselves as, we're not the harmful drug, but this can act as a gateway into more dangerous drugs. And this can act as a gateway to addiction, which is extremely difficult to overcome. And what's important to note too is that e-cigarettes are just as harmful. These companies don't want you to think that, it can cause lung cancer. You may need a voice box. Your relationship with your family might become strained because you've turned to drugs. But it's also important to realize that you may not have the experience or the help that that person needs to for rehabilitation. So, reaching out to one of the resources that my fellow podcast members mentioned before might be the best way to go. And if you see the situation escalating, or you see that you might turn to drugs as well, or you may be prompted to maybe smoke with him or her, creating distance between that friend might also be the best option. You don't necessarily have to cut them off if you don't feel comfortable with that, but maybe declining to hang out with them once in a while, or not watching their stories can help create some distance and show them that you don't really support their actions, but you'll always be there to help them.
So our next question comes from a 17-year-old girl who asked, I always see people laughing together in the bathrooms and smoking, and no one ever seems to be harmed. Is it really that bad? I've been offered stuff at parties, but I just don't know what to do. Is it lame to avoid it?
All right, that's a really good question. I think there's really nothing lame about avoiding something that you know is going to be harmful to you. And it's also important to note, people are only showing the good side of drugs because they're in front of other people, but the negative sides of addiction can really come out when you're alone, and you're not really going to realize that until you're in the situation. And that question is actually, I think, a really good connection to our next point, which is actually all about romanticism and marketing of drugs. So, Ariba, do you want to explain what romanticism is?
Yeah, so essentially it's like presenting something, reviewing something as beautiful or romantic when it can actually cause harm. Also known as glamorizing, for example, like making memes about anxiety or depression. So we have a few topics that we want to dive into the like romanticism and marketing bit, because as teenagers we're not thinking critically when it comes to like looking at advertisements or watching TV shows. So we just want to bring that awareness to you guys. And like the previous question we had before about juice and vape, we want to talk about vaping and juuling, because I know everybody has seen like someone in the washroom doing vape and juul, and you guys probably think it's cool. Well, it's not. Okay, so what's the appeal of vaping and juuling? Well, there's different flavors, right? Like they're candy or like a lollipop. Most notable is like mango, mint. Do you guys know any other flavors?
Can't say that I do.
In fact, the whole appeal to like young people wanting to juul is the flavors. Canada has actually banned the company Juul from selling flavored pods, because it's like, like it's like cigarettes but mango. Like, who wouldn't want to do that, right? It's
There's such an
specifically,
appeal.
yeah, it's specifically being branded to younger people. It's like putting on rose colored glasses. Like, you're not thinking, oh yeah, this thing will give me cancer, but it's a mango cloud.
It's misrepresentation and it's manipulation on Juul's part. And I'm really
Yeah.
grateful that the government actually stepped in, because when you're marketing it to that degree where it's just a fun little snack, it's just juice. Even the term where we're saying juice instead of like e-liquid or cigarette liquid or vapor, that in itself is very, very manipulative.
It makes it seem a lot more lighthearted or fun or not as harmful as it really is, which it's really misleading, especially to kids. When here, kids as young as in middle schools are seeing this everywhere. So obviously they're not going to think critically about the messages that they're seeing. They're just going to think that it's something fun and everyone's doing it, so why not?
Yeah, and what's really important to know, like bouncing off of your point, when you compare the packaging of e-cigarettes versus regular cigarettes have like a warning label, although sometimes include like a photo of tumors or voice boxes, like the negative impacts of smoking and of nicotine. Well, Juul never had that, and actually the FDA has forced the company to create bigger warning labels and to include the negative side effects. So that shows the intentions of the company. They did not want to show the harmful negative side, things that would gross kids out, and we had to see the government step in and force them to do those things. And in fact, 60% of illicit drug use in Canada is are from people of the ages 15 to 24. That is crazy.
And this is at a time where your brain is developing at the highest rate, and to have something that impactful come into that process and completely wipe out and decrease that rate, it's really, really harmful. And because it's such a recent thing, it's such a recent trend, there's not enough longitudinal studies to even examine the impact of that. So we have to really be aware of the decisions that we are making and realize how, especially as teenagers, as kids, how these decisions are going to impact us long term, not just now.
And that point you mentioned, Ariba, as well, about 60% of illicit drug users being between like those young ages. It's also like so important because us as students, there's a lot of temptation, because like as students, we might be tempted to turn to study pills to help us stay focused and increase the time we can spend working. And, a lot of us have pulled all-nighters, drank coffee while working. But these pills contain like a concentrated amount of caffeine, and the dangers of caffeine include things like anxiety, insomnia, rapid heart rate, high blood pressure, and fatigue, which is really ironic. And there's also just such romanticism and normalization of being like sleep deprived, pulling all-nighters, or seeing who has it the worst. Like your problems, your trauma, It's not supposed to be a competition, and constantly trying to see who has it worse reinforces these negative behaviors of being sleep deprived, using caffeine, study pills, all of that.
Yeah, like
Definitely. And just adding on to that, with the whole studying aspect of it and school aspect, it's, as you said, it's just become so normalized where it's like if you're not pulling all-nighters in high school, it's like, are you even working? How are you, like, you must be a genius, from birth, where that's not necessarily the fact. That's not true. You have to make sure to prioritize your health, and to make sure that you're not trying these unhealthy methods to, stay up all night or to study longer, and because they're really, in the long run, they're not gonna help you, and they're very harmful.
yeah, and like having a cup of coffee to like boost your energy, or even pulling an all-nighter because you procrastinate a project, like we've all been there. You should never feel like super guilty or be like, I'm gonna like become a drug addict now or whatever. It's totally fine once in a while, but when it becomes a normal habit of you relying on caffeine and it's no longer strong enough that you want to turn to things like Red Bull or caffeine pills or study pills, and you're pulling all-nighters every day, it's really important to assess your mental health and what's causing you to turn to these things. So like talking to your teachers, talking to your parents, your guidance counselor about workload, time management, or giving you even like more time to complete an assignment that you procrastinated. It's more important than turning to these dangerous methods.
Yeah.
And onto that, do you guys want to talk about something that we all see every single day, TV shows and movies, arguably the biggest contributor to the romanticism of drug use? So in TV shows, we always see the cool kids, the main characters, the protagonists doing drugs. For example, in Euphoria, the creators of the show aim to show the real side of teenage addiction and drug use, and experts have praised their portrayal, unlike previous shows that have aimed to do the same thing. But the problem is, with the nice outfits, the beautiful colors, the music, the cinematography, it still glamorizes drugs because, especially if you're a younger kid, like we mentioned before, you're not thinking as critically. You're just seeing like your favorite actor do drugs, or you're seeing all these pretty colors. And yeah, you may see like the person fighting with their parents, having to go in and out of rehab, but you're thinking about, oh, but look at all the pretty colors and look at how cool they look while doing drugs. You'll be like prompted to do them. And I think it's really important to watch these shows at a later age. Like the characters may be 15 years old and you may be 15 as well, but at 15, you're not thinking critically, your brain hasn't developed. And not every 15-year-old goes through like drug addiction, partying, that life. So you may feel like, I'm not really like a cool kid. And I personally recommend like waiting to watch the shows until like you're over the age of 20.
Yeah, and about that shows, just adding on, it really, to a certain extent, it really is important because it does start a conversation. Like the shows that you mentioned, like Euphoria, for example, it has started a conversation among whether it be critics or just teens in general, about this topic, which is important. It needs to be something that's talked about. But those who do watch it also need to be actively like criticizing whatever it is that they're watching. So you have to be aware as you're watching it that the glamorization, or as you said, the romanticism of the substance abuse, it's not true, and it's really not as wonderful and magical as it's shown to be. And adding on to that, with the whole TV shows and movies, and especially, as you said, seeing our favorite actors or celebrities using drugs, another factor that plays into this is social media, where we have access to seeing all these celebrities and actors and actresses and singers who do, whether it be intentionally or unintentionally, promote the use of drugs as they post pictures or stories of themselves, and we have to be aware that aware of the influence that has on kids, especially younger kids, who you look up to this person, you want to be what they are, you want to do what they do. But even with that, we have to be aware that what they're doing is not right, and we have to talk about that, and we have to start a conversation about, even though they're celebrities and we want to be like them or we look up to them, their actions, they need to be criticized by us and other kids.
Yeah, and another important thing is that the actual industry of drugs and illegal narcotics is actually very, very violent. The industry is extremely predatory. And that side hasn't really been shown until recently, but they're not showing you the dangers in a way. They're romanticizing it like the topic of discussion, and they make you want to deal drugs, become a gang member, to live out that fantasy of being the underdog, of moving your family out of the trenches, as they call it. And in fact, for all my Canadians out there, you probably know the Instagram account called SixBuzz. They are notoriously known for like promoting violence and gangs through like memes and by posting songs that include lyrics like that. But then they turn around and post, oh, you know, this like young kid or this up and coming star got like murdered because of the industry. And it's like, well, how can you raise awareness while you're still promoting it? Dima, do you want to continue on with that point?
I just wanted to, talk about the hypocrisy kind of that Aribo's kind of alluding to, where you're turning around and saying, oh, rest in peace, like whatever young star has just died. But then you're also continuously, constantly spreading, oh, this lyric where I'm going to shoot you all, I'm going to do this, this, this. And it's just constantly promoting these violent messages. And from kind of a sports point of view, sports, it was kind of a vehicle, I guess, to what Aribo was talking about, kind of get your family out the hood, get your family out the projects. So that's how it originally started, right? So when a star, for example, like LeBron James, when he comes out of St. Mary and he's amazing, right? Like he's incredible. He's getting his family that generational wealth. And then that was constantly the story of many, many people, right? Gilbert Arenas, Nick Young, all these guys who grew up in these pretty tough, pretty rough, violent environments. And they got to that point where they can now raise their families in the suburbs and all of these things. But now it's the point where so much money is being put into, for example, AAU circuits and finding these talents and scouting all these guys, to the point where families who grew up in the suburbs now still want to act hard, and they still want to pretend that, we came out of these places. And this is not something that's light, right? Coming out of the projects and straight out the trenches, this is not something that's easy. And to be a child in that environment, it is very, very difficult to get out. So to romanticize it and glamorize it to the point where it's like somebody who grew up with all the resources that they want to, but there's still, whether it's performance enhancing drugs or recreational, whatever it may be, there's a very, very real increase in, for example, in Canada, there's a very real increase in homicide victims yearly, right? There's a very strong increase in gun violence. And John Tory always comes out and says all these things and proposes all these actions and plans. And that's really important, to take initiative and to do all these things. But we also have to understand that this is not a life that you want to crave. You don't want to be this hero. If you're in that situation and you get out, that is incredible and that is amazing, and you're beating the odds completely. But to want that life and to crave that sort of story when that's not you, when that's not something that's authentic to your life story at all, is very, very dangerous. And it's a very, very negative story that we keep seeing all around. And it doesn't have to just be in basketball, it's in pretty much every sport. But it's a very, very bad narrative that we need to kind of dismantle slowly, because it's not something that we can keep redoing just every single year, where you'll see these guys who have just the most amount of tools and resources by their side continuously go down to that level where they don't know what it's like.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people forget that there is financial aid out there specific to teens. If you reach out to your school or your guidance counselor, or even search up online, there's a lot of things that help you, make it easier to get into college or university, or they help you find summer jobs or part-time job opportunities, help you network. So we pay school in a negative light, but there's a lot of resources out there. And if your school isn't as supportive of you, it's always a simple Google search. Like, there's always another option, which I think Dima was really trying to emphasize on.
Yeah. All right. We're going to now just to conclude the episode. There are a lot of factors and influences that contribute to why people do drugs, such as peer pressure, romanticism, and marketing, and just glamorization of the whole thing. And there is a culture of normalization of harmful things and competition. And just to end off, hopefully make maybe a more lighthearted mood, I guess we're going to do our second segment, which is actually Never Have I Ever, but peer pressure edition, because we all experience peer pressure probably on the daily. We all have these experiences. And so we have a few prompts here that are based off of that. All right, so I guess we'll
10
hold.
or 5?
I think 5 would probably work for this.
Okay.
Right. Never have I ever chose the same clothes, hairstyle, or jewelry as my friends, or I guess just change the way you dress, maybe. Uh,
100%.
I have to. I think we all have probably.
100%.
Not me stealing Dima's crew neck thing.
Literally, yeah. Never have I ever listened to the same music or watched the same TV shows as my friends. Yeah.
I got no personality.
Again,
I feel like that's all we talk about.
yeah, literally. I was going to say,
That's the only thing we have to talk about.
yeah, this is one of the things we touched on. Like, it doesn't always have to be a negative peer pressure. Like, yeah, you guys recommend some good shows. Never have I ever changed the way I talk or the words I use.
Yeah.
I think, yeah,
When we do British accents in it.
truly. I think it comes naturally just talking to different people, you kind of change. Never have I ever taken risks or broken rules.
Or what?
I guess just based on what your friends are doing.
Does sending gifts during an exam count? 'Cause then yes, I have.
Maybe. I don't know if that one applies as much. This one might. Worked harder at school or not worked as hard. I guess it's like a
Yeah.
positive and negative. Yeah, probably. And that's all the questions I have. So yeah, that was a very enlightening experience. Yeah.
But it can really show that everyone, like out of the 4 of us, I mean, we've all faced the experience of peer pressure like one way or another. And it really proves that peer pressure isn't, when people think peer pressure, it's always like negative, the whole thing, like if your friend jumps off a bridge, like, would you jump? Like, that's not what it is all the time. And we need to be aware of that when we
Like the clothing thing, like it can be fun sometimes. Like I'm only wearing a sweater because last episode Dima was wearing a sweater. Like that's why. It can be a cool fun thing sometimes, just the show thing as well. So yeah. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this episode. This has been
Bad.
Girls.
good.
advice.
Ah.
See you next time.
Bye, guys.